Good afternoon and welcome to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. Our topic for today's discussion is strategic synergy, the role of capability alignment in securing preferential resource allocation from suppliers. Please be sure to ask any questions using the chat, or if you have any comments, please put those in the chat as well for Andre and Stephen. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to you, Stephen.
Okay. Hey, well, everybody, it's always good, either virtual or in person, to be chatting with my friends from Rochester. Happy to be here with my excellent colleague, Andrea Patrucco. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about a project that Andrea's been working on for a bit, and I joined his team on this project. And it's kind of like thinking about what makes a mom pick their favorite kid. That's kind of, or maybe a dad. What makes a parent pick their favorite kid? And so, since I've joined this project, it's been kind of an interesting thing. So, who am I? I'm Stephen Carnovale. Some of you might know me. I'm a professor of supply chain management at Florida Atlantic, and I'll let Andrea introduce himself before we go on.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Andrea Patrucco. I'm also in South Florida. I'm with Florida International University College of Business in the Department of Marketing and Logistics.
All right, so maybe we'll move toward the next slide. So what we wanted to do to kind of introduce the big picture, like I said, it's a little bit about picking your favorite kid, but in reality, this is a practical problem many procurement professionals that we've both spoken to in the past or currently that they face. And essentially the idea is, if I'm allocating treatment, precious time and energy towards suppliers, what is it that drives me to pick one supplier over the other? And obviously there's some straightforward things that might come across like, well, the best quality product, always on time. The typical kind of OTIF efficiency-driven metrics of why we would pick a supplier. But Andrea started looking at this, and we wanted to kind of introduce these questions in the beginning, and then we're going to go into the investigation and what we found and some nuanced things. But to kick it off, I mean, as you follow this presentation, think about this thing, these questions. What is it? What capabilities do you look for in suppliers when you're selecting strategic partners? Not your arm's length stuff, but your real important suppliers. And in terms of actually, whether or not you're favoring buyers and suppliers, what are those? Are there complementary capabilities, or maybe there's something else, right? What is driving this? Thinking about procurement teams and in this crazy world in which we live, responsiveness and agility, all these buzzwords pop up. What is it that procurement and sourcing professionals can actually do in order to build responsive capabilities to be able to handle the chaos that inevitably pops up in today's market, in this global chaotic market in which we live? Then think about, too, as we progress through this conversation, a little bit about what key performance indicators or internal metrics make you want to or shift over these preferential resources, right? Why would you favor one child over the other? And then, are there anything else in your experience as you're thinking about this? And as we continue, by the way, please enter your input into the chat. But outside of these core capabilities that we look to foster in our supply bases, what else might influence the behavior in the supplier? So that's kind of the big picture of the question. We're going to look at this alignment, what drives capabilities, preferential treatment. We can go to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Andrea. He and I are going to go back and forth a little bit about this, but I'll let him continue.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve. So as you were saying, so the idea is that we wanted to take a closer look at preferential treatment and why it's critical for procurement. So just as to align our definitions, so preferential treatment is the process through which a supplier prioritizes certain buyers over others, or vice versa from the buyer's perspective, the process through which buyers prioritize other suppliers over other partners, which is often based on how well a buyer aligns with the supplier's strategic goals. So this is also called the preferential resource allocation. And why it is important? Because, of course, from the buyer perspective, if a supplier, especially a strategic partner, extend preferential treatment to your company, of course, they elevate your status in different ways. They give you access to scarce resources. They offer customized solution. They offer you more favorable pricing or terms and this kind of stuff. So basically, what is important to have preferential treatment, to understand what drive preferential treatment, because it offers the buyer strategic advantage. They offer them a priority position when the supplier make their choice. This topic is not new, like especially from a research perspective here. I mean, I don't want to like go through this in detail, but if you look at what has been studied before, both in practice and also in the literature, like you find already a lot of drivers of preferential treatment. So often many of them are pretty straightforward from like practitioner perspective, like the economic value for the supplier. So clearly supplier prioritize buyers who bring them higher revenue or higher, stronger strategic growth opportunities. Large volume buyers, like for example, Walmart, often secure favorable terms because of their big buying power. Relational quality, of course, supplier prioritize a strong trust-based relationship with buyers that provide this type of advantage and provide them better treatment. So if a supplier can see the possibility to build a long-term partnership, clearly is going to prioritize that company. The interaction instruments are also important. So the way buyers manage a supplier relationship also matter. A buyer that invests in regular communication, collaborative planning, information sharing, joint problem solving, all of these lower the transaction cost of the relationships, which makes the supplier more prone to favor preferential treatment. Last but not least, compatibility in strategic and operational goals. So suppliers and also buyers, so you like to work with a company that is aligned in terms of how you manage and handle the processes, but also what are your long-term objectives. So if a supplier is focused on sustainability practices, well, they would like to prioritize buyers that also pursue sustainability goals, and so on. Anything to add, Steve, to this?
Yeah, one thing I was just going to say, and it's probably taken for granted with this group, is that all of this highlights the importance that we've been talking about for years now, which is to say what we do is not tactical. It is strategic in nature, which is why this topic is so important. And so you can move forward, Andrea. But the fact that we're shifting towards, or maybe we have finally made the shift to it being a strategic role within the firm, that's why these things are so important to us, and why this alignment of preferential treatment is something we're interested in.
Yeah. And the question is, like, I'm sure that all procurement professionals already have this problem in their mind. So how can I secure preferred source from the supplier? And all of these things are there. We need to invest in the relationship. We need to be sure we provide them good business. We need to be sure that the interaction is not at high cost for the supplier. We need to align strategic goals. So all of this is like pretty straightforward nowadays. So after what happened in the last 4 years and the unpredictability of the market, we ask ourselves, like, what can be said more? So especially talking with supplier, we have seen that there's been like a shift a little bit in their decision-making process. Because if you look at all the recent disruption in global supply chain, like COVID, pandemic, geopolitical tension, trade wars, raw materials storage, so it kind of like triggers supplier in putting other factors into play. Like few examples. So during COVID, like companies that could quickly switch to production or adjust sourcing strategy, like automakers, fare much better. Or like following the geopolitical conflict, Russia, Ukraine, that disrupted energy and food sector, buyer with flexible procurement strategy were able to secure alternative energy or raw material sources faster than others that could allow them to recover better from this disruption. And we've seen a lot of sudden raw material shortages, like lithium for electric vehicles battery, semiconductor, and they have shown this event. They have shown us that buyers with resilient supplier network are better positioned to secure critical supply when markets are stricter. So what is the bottom line of this is that what we have seen is that today supply chain need to be more responsive. So in this condition, the focus of the supply chain has shifted toward building responsive supply chain, which means that the supply chain ability to react to unexpected changes in a way that performance are not negatively affected. That brought us to the point in our research project. So as responsiveness as a capability of the supply chain as a work, as a network has become so important, probably aligning capabilities between buyer and supplier on this dimension paved the way for attractive more interest from the supplier. So if a buyer has higher responsiveness capabilities, probably the supplier would be more attractive to this buyer. So will be more open to give them preferential treatment, because today this is the capabilities that the supply chain network need to have. So here the core question it has become key, strategic to build responsiveness capabilities in supply chain. Is this something that affects preferential treatment as well? So if a supplier can recognize that a buyer can contribute positively to the responsiveness of the supply chain, is the supplier just for that, forget about the other factor we just discussed, just for that, is the supplier willing to provide this buyer preferential treatment and prefer resource just for that? I don't know if Steve wants to add something on top of it.
Perfect.
Okay. Now, before moving forward, the question is, when we talk about responsiveness, what type of capabilities were included when we talk about responsiveness? Now, we can discuss, you might have a different view, but from a theoretical perspective, usually when we talk about responsiveness, the responsiveness is the combination of these 5 capabilities, and each capability plays a distinct role in helping procurement teams and their supplier to manage unpredictable event. Agility. Formally, agility is the ability to respond quickly and effectively to unexpected changes in demand or supply condition. So it ensures that organization can adjust operation or sourcing plan very rapidly in the short term. So example, imagine like a fashion retailer faces a delay from one of its key supplier. If a retailer has agile capabilities, can quickly switch to an alternate supplier to avoid the stock out in the short term, and recover from the material that was delayed. Flexibility. Flexibility is the ability to modify or reconfigure the operation, a process, or a product line in response to changing market conditions without losing efficiency. In a typical example, during the COVID pandemic, is a manufacturer able to repurpose their production line to produce PPE. So flexibility allow businesses, allow operation to shift resources to meet evolving demand. Resilience, capacity to recover from disruption and restore operation without negatively impacting the performance. Very popular example, 2018 earthquake in Japan. Toyota was one of the companies that was able to adjust supply chain by diversifying the supplier that were not able to produce and stockpiling critical parts, ensuring that if something else then would have happened again, they would have not disrupted the supply chain and the operation as it happened when the earthquake took place. That's a good one. Improvisation. Improvisation instead is more like, look at more like the creative and problem-solving aspect. So it's the ability to create, to design novel solution on the spot when unforeseen supply chain challenging emerge. So example, imagine that a country just put a sudden import restriction. A company now need to figure a way to, for example, if it is a food manufacturer, they put an import restriction on some like raw material. Well, a manufacturer need to find a way quickly to address local farmer, for example, to like be able to supply their production process with the raw material that they were previously importing. So having a quick thinking and creativity is part of improvisation capability. Last but not least, adaptability. Adaptability is like the long-term version of agility, because it's the ability to adjust and evolve supply chain operation, internal and external, strategically over time in response to systematic market and demand conditions. So something that is a structural change in the market, in the demand, in the technology, in the regulation that allow a company, that require a company to change their processes. This change need to be permanent and need to be done in the quickest way as possible, minimize the impact on the operational performance. For example, if supplier adopting green technologies to meet new sustainability regulation is an example of adaptability. There is a new regulation that make your production process no more compliant. The ability to redeploy a new technology in the production process without disrupting the production process is part of the adaptability capabilities. So the idea behind is that today companies need to invest in these capabilities if they want to build a more responsive network. Each of these capabilities play a role in building responsive supply chain. The core question is, are investment in these capabilities and alignment in these capabilities between the buyer and the supplier. So if a buyer is more agile, more flexible, more resilient, more has more improvisation capabilities and more adaptable, is this a factor of attractiveness for the supplier? Meaning that if the supplier recognizes that the buyer has these capabilities, then there is a higher tendency to allocate preferential treatment to this buyer or not. That is the point of start. We didn't have an answer to this question before we started this project, and that was like the overall objective of when we start this research. I don't know if Steve wants to add something else.
Nothing more to add. That was perfect.
So these were the kind of like the two core questions. So does capability alignment between buyer and supplier lead to preferential treatment? And if the answer is yes or no, but like if the answer is yes, is which buyer capabilities should procurement team prioritize to gain preferential treatment? And so the overall question is, I know that procurement people have their head all over the place. They have to think about 3,000 things when planning their supplier relationship management. So we want to understand, should procurement team also focus on this? So do I have to think about matching supplier capabilities or increasing supplier capability or developing complementary capabilities when thinking about preferential treatment decision on the supplier side? So that was the kind of like the theoretical question and then the practical implication of this project. So how did we design this? So first, we went to the buyer and we asked them, okay, we want to know about your responsiveness capabilities. Then we went to their supplier and we said, okay, now we want to know about the supplier capabilities. Then we came back and we say, okay, now we have the buyer capabilities and their supplier capabilities. Is there alignment? So are these capabilities aligned? So is the buyer higher, the supplier higher? Are they similar? And based on this, is there any relationship between this alignment or misalignment, this complementarity or non-complementarity, and the preferential treatment given by the supplier?
Actually, Andrea, can you just go back 1 second?
Yes, sure.
And one thing that's worth noting here, and I think the thing that makes it the project the most interesting is well, it's two things. There's many things, but two things stand out. The first is that last question, because it really is precious time and resources being allocated in developing the supply base. So do you go out in the supplier selection process and try to align completely with what you've got so that it's just two positives making something even more positive? Or should you balance out what you don't have with what they do have? And I think that was the first thing that kind of pulled us in, certainly pulled me in. And then the development of how we did this, which Andrea is going to talk about in a second, matching it between the buyers and the suppliers and having the rating being whether or not you perceive them to be higher or lower than your capabilities gives a fresh perspective, kind of an honest perspective on to what degree alignment works, because all of those responsiveness capabilities, there's 5 of them, they're all one part of a bigger whole. So the question is, which matter, to what degree, and how am I going to nurture these within the supply base to somehow develop preferential treatment, financial benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's just an important point to note, because it's a critical question that remains, at least from the academic side, unanswered. Practically, if you have any response to this, we'd love to hear it. But that is just one thing I wanted to highlight. So please, Andrea, you can go ahead.
Yeah, and no, that's perfect, because that connect to this. Because so in theory, we don't have an answer to that, because again, we don't want to annoy you as much with like theoretical aspects. But if you look at like academic theory of buyer-supplier relationship, in this area, we have 2 complementary views. So on one side, we had what we call like the social exchange theory of industrial relationships. So this theory suggests that supplier, in an industrial relation, in a B2B relationship, business partners allocate more resources to partner who complement their strengths rather than match them. So for example, like based on this theory, a flexible buyer might be preferred by a rigid supplier because they compensate for each other's weaknesses. So if we look at this perspective, we should say that capability alignment shouldn't matter in preferential treatment. Actually, it's capability misalignment that matter, because buyer and supplier look for like complementing each other when entering in strategic relationships. But on the other side, we have something called congruence theory. Congruence theory says that instead, business partner prefer other partner whose capabilities or work characteristic aligns with their. So, for example, a high-tech supplier with advanced manufacturing technology might prefer working with the buyer who also uses similar system, because they are aligned. These reduce friction and ensure a smooth collaboration. So we have this kind of like 2 complementary view, and that is something that we would like to hear in your experience as procurement professional as well. So I think that even after this study, like we have a position, but like it's not going to be universal. So when you look into like your supplier partner, so which of these theory you think reflect best your experience? So do you or your supplier, you see them or your company prioritizing supplier with similar capabilities, or do you see supplier prioritizing buyers with similar capabilities, or you think that the complementary strength approach is the one that must fit the like this type of perspective?
You just put those in the chat. Yeah. If you have any responses, feel free to put those in the chat.
Yeah, I think we'll also have like a kind of like a discussion at the end. So like if you have any question or observation, and we'll pick up all at the end, and we'll take it from there. Now, we didn't want to go too much into the details of the method and what we did, but like just to for your information, what we did was that we did a survey where we reach out to the buyer first and ask them about to self-assess their responsiveness capabilities, so agility, adaptability, alignment, resilience, flexibility, and then we asked them the list of their major supplier with whom they thought some sort of preferential treatment was in place. So we asked them, okay, give us a list and reference and contact point for this supplier with whom you think there is some sort of preferential treatment in place. It might have not been the case. This was just the perception of the buyer. So then we went to the supplier and asked the same question. So asked them self-rate the level of your capabilities, and we actually asked them the preferential treatment level that was in place with that buyer. So no matter what the buyer told us, then the supplier gave us the information of if there was a preferential treatment in place in terms of allocation of preferred resources to that buyer. Collected this data, we have matched them clearly. So we have matched buyer with their supplier pair, and we have analyzed if there was a relationship between alignment in capabilities and the level of preferential treatment in place. Any comments, Steve?
Nope.
So what did we find? So this is kind of like the overall framework of the research. So you can see that you have the responsiveness here of the supplier, which is made of the 5 different capabilities, and then we have the responsiveness capability of the buyer, and these are the 5 capabilities. So the idea was that, okay, based on the level of these 2 capabilities, is there higher or lower chance that the supplier is going to give the buyer preferential treatment? So the first very interesting finding that we want to hear your thought about is that, surprisingly or not, for us it was a little bit surprising, but we hear your thought about it, that such an exchange prevails. So suppliers allocate more resources to buyers who has misaligned capabilities. Particularly, what was interesting is that suppliers have the tendency to give preferential treatment to buyer who has lower responsiveness capabilities than the supplier themselves. That's what we call like misaligned relationship. So surprisingly, suppliers are attracted by buyers that are less capable in terms of responsiveness capabilities. Now, the next point was that what capabilities are relevant? So out of the 5 capabilities, 4 are relevant: agility, flexibility, resilience, and improvisation. So when the supplier has higher capability in improvisation, resilience, flexibility, and agility compared to the buyer, there is a higher chance that they are giving the buyer preferential treatment. So what we're going to say is that if you want to attract a supplier in terms of preferential treatment, do not overemphasize too much this capability, because from the supplier perspective, this can be a trigger that lead to less tendency to preferential treatment and prefer resource allocation. Now, another surprising thing was that adaptability doesn't matter. So adaptability is actually like the words of the moment. Supply chain need to be adaptable. They need to evolve. They need to adjust. They need to be ready to change. Well, in our study, and again, our sample is pretty big. We're talking about over 400 suppliers and I think like 150 buyers. So not clearly, we don't want to like make it universally acceptable, but we have a good empirical base. In our case, we said that in the decision-making process of the supplier, the alignment in adaptability capabilities doesn't matter. So if you buyer are very adaptable and the supplier is more or less adaptable or vice versa, this doesn't affect the decision on the allocation of preferential treatment.
You know, one thing too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. And you're probably going to get into this, but one thing that we were thinking about, so if you remember from all of these capabilities that Andrea put before, the one difference between adaptability was kind of a longer term sort of focus, whereas agility, flexibility, resilience, and this improvisation, it's almost like now. It's like immediate, or at least nearer term. So that's something to think about as you're thinking about whether that resonates with you, and you're thinking about managing the supply base. Is the near term kind of weighted more than the longer term? And in the next slide, Andrea is going to talk a little bit about this at a high level, but thinking about that, is the longer term view something that detracts away from why adaptability might not matter?
Yeah, that's exactly the point of this slide. So if you think about from a buyer perspective, a relationship with strategic supplier is always something that it's oriented toward the long term. So you think that you have to show the supplier that you have the ability to sustain the relationship, to support the relationship cycle on the long term. One of the, again, surprising finding is that when deciding about preferential treatment, which is something that should be long-term oriented, one of the most important long-term capabilities, adaptability, doesn't matter. So the supplier decide on preferential treatment if there is a misalignment in our capability, but like they seem not to look, at least from a statistical perspective, at the long-term aspect. So basically, the main message that emerged from our research is that don't stress your adaptability capability, your capability of change and adapt and drive the supply chain in the long term, because the supplier do not put this in their decision making. Now, we don't have an answer of why is that, because again, with survey, you collect the data and you have like a statistical relationship. We don't know why that happened, the content of the, like why that relationship take place. That is something that we would happy to hear your thought and consideration about it. But that was pretty amazing because again, if you think about it, adaptability instead is something that today a lot of companies are pushing toward. Like it's not enough to like put in place a system that is able to change quickly, but in the short term, this change needs to be sustainable over time. Instead, the supplier seems not to value this type of capability. Now, a couple of other like collateral aspects of our study, clearly like we use like different statistical technique. We didn't find any significance in terms of control variable. So, I mean, we didn't have evidence that by supplier in certain industry or of certain size or that have certain level of revenues have more orientation toward preferential treatment or not. Sorry, I didn't mention this just to give a little bit of context. So all the data was collected after COVID. So we're still like in the new era. So the data was collected in 2022. So we're already like in the world, how it has experienced shortage and disruption or whatever. So we're seeing that there was no particular control variable that were significant to highlight from a practitioner perspective. One thing I wanted to bring your attention is that we also factor in what we call the relationships asset specificity. So when a buyer is in a strategic relationship with the supplier, it is possible that buyer and supplier make complementary investment. Like for example, we buy a specific we patent a specific technology together, or we co-participate in buying a new type of technology, or we share resources, engineer, knowledge, this type of stuff. So we said, okay, but like as capabilities are like a soft aspect and investment are a more like hard, tangible aspect. So if there is an investment in place, does this combine with the consideration regarding the capabilities? And that it was another interesting finding. So by itself, relationship asset specificity impact preferential treatment, which means that if a supplier has invested already in the relationship, they are more likely to give you the buyer preferential treatment. That's kind of straightforward, but that like reinforce results that we already knew before. But they do not combine with the alignment in capabilities, which means that these are two independent factors. So if you're thinking about how to attract a supplier, do not think, well, like I'm very agile, but I know that the supplier doesn't value my higher agility if he's not agile as well. But well, they have invested a lot in the relationship, so this might fade. No, these two factors are independent. The supplier decide based on the investment, and then on a separate like channel, they look at capabilities. So these two factors do not interact, which was also pretty interesting. So capabilities like a soft aspect and investment, a hard aspect, they don't interact with each other positively or negatively. So these aspects do not increase or decrease the effect of capability alignment. So key takeaway, just to like wrap up a little bit, capability misalignment. So if you are a buyer, you should know that there is more attractiveness from the supplier if your capabilities are lower than the supplier. I don't know, Steve, how did you call it? Like the power effect, the dominance effect of the supplier, like supplier like to give preferential treatment to buyer where they seems that they dominated in capability. Use a term. I don't have it on top of my head.
I don't remember the term, but I kind of think about it like when I used to play hockey. It was much easier for me to play with people that weren't as good as me because it made myself feel a lot better about my skills. And maybe that's kind of what we're seeing with this misalignment, right? So that's kind of what I'll have to think of the word, Andrea. I don't remember it off the top of my head either, but yeah.
Yeah. Adaptability, again, a lot of focus, but we're not saying that adaptability should not be a focus in terms of capability. Remember, I was just thinking about preferential treatment. So adaptability can be used for like other area, but like in our for our like outcome variable, it doesn't seem to have a role. And then the history of the relationship. So if there were previous investment in place, this doesn't interact, this doesn't affect the supplier decision-making process. So in practice, what are the main, like if you want to have a path toward like, okay, today I need to retain or gain preferential treatment from a supplier. So you need to leverage complementary strengths. So first of all, the main message is that you don't have to match the supplier capabilities. So one important message our research give to buyer is that, oh my gosh, if I'm not as the supplier is not gonna consider me. Actually, that's not the case. In our case, there's that the supplier is gonna consider you if you don't have a profile like the one the supplier has. Second, now I didn't want to deep dive, but some capabilities combine together better than other ones. In terms of if your question is, okay, then should I disinvest or consider all of them? No, we run also some other analysis where like we find if combination of different capabilities lead to higher or lower preferential treatment. We provide 2 examples here. One of the strongest solution was combining improvisation and agility. So pushing of how your improvisation and agility capabilities can be complementary to the one of your supplier can be a way to attract preferential treatment and also ensure that you have a balance between resilience and improvisation. So based on our data, buyers that have a balance in resilience and improvisation, although lower than those of the supplier, are able to attract preferential treatment. So the supplier also look at the level of this competence, of these capabilities within the buyer organization. And last, again, I already said that multiple times, but adaptability in the context of preferential treatment is not as critical. So when you are at a negotiation table or you're in conversation with the supplier, pushing this capability to obtain higher resources from the supplier might not be as effective as you think it might be. Anything to add, Steve?
Nope.
So looping back now, these are still the question that, I mean, we have a little bit of an answer to this after the study, but again, our study look at relationship. It doesn't open the black box really. So if you have any question or consideration regarding, okay, but what are the capabilities based on your experience supplier look for when looking for a strategic partner, and vice versa, are these the capabilities you look for in supplier when you look for strategic partners? What do you think? Is better to have a fit or to have complementarity? And have you ever thought about this responsiveness concept that instead we talk a lot, at least in theory, and most importantly, we give you a soft way to assess preferential treatment based through the capability concept, but in practice, how are you assessing, if you ever thought about the relationship between preferential treatment and capabilities, or at the first time you heard about that? And clearly there are not all factors considered in the study. If you have suggestion in terms of supplier behavior or aspect that can impact this relationship, we'll be happy to hear your thoughts about it. That's it. So this is our contact in case you want to have more information regarding our research, or you want to offer an offline talk, we'll be happy to set up a meeting or collect your thoughts about this.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of information.
We do our best to provide value.
I know you do. If anybody has any questions, please be sure to put it in the chat. Now would be, the best time before we end. But I did want to ask you, what do you think would be based on everything that you've done, the future of the buyer-supplier relationships evolving going forward?
I think, at least from my perspective, I had a talk with somebody yesterday about where various artificial intelligence tools can come in like the RFP evaluation process. And so if you pivot over to this work, and I'll let Andrea comment as well, but if you pivot over to what we're looking at, it's pretty easy to evaluate some of these. It's not so easy to evaluate others. And if you're in the process of evaluating RFPs, knowing kind of where these differences should exist in order to optimize on the procurement front, there could be some generative AI component there in the evaluation process. But I think it's, if you think about what an RFP, it's got the classic, 30% this criteria, 20% that criteria. Maybe those criteria need to shift to think about, rather than am I getting the best supplier possible, am I getting the right supplier for my needs possible? And this alignment type work can color in what exactly those criteria might be. That's just one thought, but I'll let Andrea comment.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing in practice by interacting with procurement is that so a lot of companies now have a lot to do. They've experienced a lot of struggle. They're scarcity on resources. Procurement organization have less people rather than like have more people. So what I'm seeing is that there is really this effort in focusing on fewer relationships, so building strong strategic partnership that, although are reliable, long-term oriented, and ensure that the company receive the goods that they need and the service that they need to run their operation, while instead there's much more focus in so why, like I was saying, that like 8-9 years ago, when you were doing your spend analysis, you were seeing that you had some contract and some supplier that were not really needed, but you say, okay, well, let's just keep them there, and in case we will need it a day, like it's not a big deal. Now today there's really an emphasis in trying to rationalize the supply base, because that's the only way that companies can keep their quality in the product, but also like decrease their costs or rationalize their costs. And in this, I think that technology, as Steve was saying, is going to play a huge component. So I've seen companies that are adopting more and investing in these technologies to do this kind of effort, like AI, big data, that allow them to analyze their data very well so that can make very good informed procurement decision, which ultimately are with the objective of, we don't necessarily have to reduce the supply base, but we have to have the right number for my company. It's not like, again, like 10 years ago, where like you have these big companies like 1,000 or like hundreds and hundreds of supplier, and no one knew where they were, why they were used, what contract were they in place. Like today, companies are really focusing on understanding where they're spending their money, why, and if that's necessary. So that leaves us to, on one side, more focused supplier relationship management. So those suppliers that stayed in the supply base are those where companies are investing in building a strong partnership. But those that are considered unneeded, companies are trying to get rid of. So I think that is where we're heading to. And again, that's something else that I'm seeing. There is a lot of risk diversification in terms of a lot of companies are thinking about, okay, is it worthwhile to have an international global supplier with longer lead times and on paper higher cost, lower cost, but higher total cost because it's an international supplier? Or should I get an international supplier and then a backup supplier that is more local that can guarantee me the supply in case something happened to the major supplier? So this kind of like mix of risk strategy within this reasoning, given what happened in the last years.
Thank you both. One other question. How can small and medium-sized SMEs compete with the larger organizations when it comes to aligning the capabilities with suppliers?
I think it's, in principle, it's the same. The scale is different, right? So, I mean, the principles that we're looking at, whether all these capabilities are able to be evaluated one way or the other. It's a question of to what degree and how much depth. I mean, Lonnie actually put a comment in the chat that probably answers this question indirectly. It's who's easiest to do business with. If you're a small and medium enterprise, your evaluation criteria is entirely different in terms of what improvisation means, what agility means, versus if you're GM looking to cull a 12,000 supplier supply base down to 2,000 or whatever the case is. So I think in practice, the process would be, or rather, the idea would be the same. The process would be different. And you know, the benefit is, because we're academics, we get to work in general terms and we talk about things at a higher level. You might tell me, no, agility in my business is something entirely different than what you've described in, you know, the automotive industry is different than the healthcare industry. Certainly, it probably is. And so, you know, the idea is at a general level, forgetting the specific dimensions, misalignment could be a good thing is the key takeaway. And then what that misalignment means is catered to the situation that it applies to. So I know that's an academic-y, high-level general, but I think that's the answer, actually. It's that, you know, because it's a general thing, it can be shifted, or at least it can be tailored to the situation at hand.
Yeah, if I can pick up on this. So my suggestion, when I work with the public sector. I work in pilot procurement. So I see a lot of small business supplier that on the other side try to sell their product to the public sector, and they have the issue on the other side. So how can we be attractive to like such a big customer? So what I always say is that from the buyer side, so if you're a small business, you know that you cannot compete on the revenue side. Like the supplier will always be more attractive to a customer that is able to provide them more revenues on the long term, blah, blah. I said, don't even try to like argue on this, because unfortunately, it's a fight against the windmill. But every small business, small, medium business has a distinctive characteristic. It can be a particular distribution channel. It can be a relationship with a specific market. It can be a particular technologies. That's what the supplier will be looking for. So today, like the market are very saturated. So supplier really looks for even like niche area where they can diversify their business or the distribution channel. So I always suggest when you discuss with your supplier, when you try to attract some of these big companies, try to emphasize what is really unique compared to their actual business. Know what they do, know where they are, know what competence they have, and then act like in complementarity based on this. Highlight what you think you can offer to this company. And again, this also depends on the supplier. You have supplier that value these aspects a lot. It's clearly you'll find a supplier that is only business oriented and it says, well, like if you can give me X amount of dollar every year, clearly I would say don't lose your time, because that's a volume and size problem that cannot be solved. But again, my suggestion is try to really find what is your unique trait that can really attract the supplier.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And if anybody has any more comments, and thank you, Lonnie, for your comment as well in the chat. Any last closing remarks before we end the session?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure for us.
Oh, great. It was a pleasure for us to have you join our webinar for today. And I look forward to working with you again for a future program. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today as well. And our next Lunch and Learn webinar for ISM Rochester will be on December 10th. Everybody have a great day. And again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.